Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be Part 34, Chapter 34, entitled A Purpose Greater Than Yourself. And now for the final fight of Round 1. Please welcome our last two competitors. Midoriya sat stiffly next to Ida, unable to shake his own nervousness at the worries of the rest of his classmates behind him. At face value, who wouldn't be nervous? He didn't need his prior trauma with Bakugo to be afraid of him. He already had his violent tendencies and explosive personality going for him. Against such a sweet girl like Uraraka, it was only natural to expect a beatdown. On her way to float to the top, it's Uraraka Ochako from the Hero Course. He could hear Jiro and Asui groan from behind him about not wanting to watch, and that kind of stirred something in him. Gami settled into the seat beside him, as far as his transparent body would let him. Practically a celebrity since his middle school days, yet his attitude clearly hasn't changed a bit. It's Bakugo Katsuki from the Hero Course. Uraraka was his friend, but more than that, she was a capable hero in training. She'd proven time after time that she could hold her own. She held such strong morals to be the best for the people that she cared about. She was kind and she was honest. She had much faith in him since the start, and even when he arguably didn't deserve it. He guessed it was normal to be nervous, but she deserved every shred of confidence that he had, not because he was trying to return the favor, but because that was the kind of strength she displayed. He respected her for her motivations, admired her for her compassion, and was confident in her for her entirety. "You've got this, Uraraka," he mumbled to himself. Paradise knows she has the entire class rooting for her. I just hope she remembers that. Ida tapped him on the shoulder, causing him to shoot his glance to the side totally unsuspiciously. Enlighten me, what sort of counter-strategy could Uraraka use to successfully beat Bakugo? Midoriya looked down, gripping his notebook tightly within his hands. Well, it's no secret that Bakugo excels in close combat, and his quirk makes him especially mobile in midair. But he held up a hand before Ida could interrupt him. But if she can get him floating, she'll gain a massive advantage. It's quite possible that's all she needs to do to win. Ida hummed. I didn't consider. Start! And that was more than enough to shut everyone up. Tense and eager to see the match before them unfold, Uraraka started by racing toward Bakugo, keeping one of her hands open and low. A rush of pride swelled within Midoriya. She figured out that her biggest advantage to use against Bakugo was to threaten his close combat fighting style with her quirk. He pushed excitedly to the edge of his seat, his heart beating a mile a minute. Bakugo didn't seem to want to dodge her charge, so that only left one thing, his signature right hook. An explosion rang out around the arena, kicking up waves of dust that bubbled into thick clouds. He couldn't see anything in the smoke, his eyes scanning rapidly to try and decipher the situation. Suddenly, Bakugo's still form revealed itself, standing unwaveringly in the center. He seemed calm, not too concerned with Uraraka's whereabouts, and it didn't seem like he needed to be, as Midoriya could make out another uniform emerge from the cloud. The blonde slammed down violently to try and pin her, but he merely was met with a loose jacket instead. Now from the clearing dust, Midoriya could see Uraraka pounce from behind, wearing just a tank top instead of her full uniform. His eyes widened from both shock and awe. She remembered his right hook from the battle training exercise. She remembered and baited him out to rush him from behind. But despite her magnificent plan, Bakugo's reaction time proved to be too much, turning around just in time to blast her away. Everyone watched and winced as she tumbled to stop a few feet further from him. He could hear his classmates start to mumble in disappointment, but he pushed their doubts away. He could feel his veins pulse and buzz with adrenaline that he didn't know he could feel outside of a fight. She could do this. Uraraka wasted no time rushing to all fours and charging again, but Bakugo was again just too fast, sweeping her away with another blast. More dust kicked into the air. Uraraka got up, though not as fast as before, and lowered herself. She continued to run at him relentlessly, but every time Bakugo simply blew her away, and every time she skidded to a stop, his heart panged stingingly. Dark scorch marks covered the ground, with chunks of the arena had straight up gone. Smoke and dust had remained in the air, swirling around an ever-constant smoke screen, but it just wasn't enough to match Bakugo's insane reaction time. His heart cracked with doubt, trying to piece at determination for her, but he hardened his resolve. He had faith in her, just as she had in him before. Her actions earlier, using her jacket to bait out Bakugo, already showed that she could think strategically on the fly. She had to have a plan, even if it just seemed like she was trying the same thing over and over again, hoping to get lucky. Suddenly, there was some loud yelling from the other side of the arena, though not coming from the battlefield. Why are they booing? Sure enough, a group of heroes had begun yelling angrily from the stands, convinced that Bakugo should just throw her out of the ring already, and something ugly bloomed in his heart. How dare they? How dare they disregard Uraraka as a competitor by trying to get her match to end early. She was worthy of a fight by the rules, and unless she was out of bounds, immobilized, or surrendered, she wasn't out. And as far as he could see, she was just back on her feet. He curled his fingers together, trying to suppress the aching buzz now at his fingertips. Is the one who said that he was toying with her a pro? If that's what you're taking away from this, you can leave. No point in watching. Go home and start job hunting. He looked up at the announcer's booth. That was Aizawa over the speakers, and Gami looked up too. She's come this far, and she knows her strength. His caution shows that he recognizes her as a worthy opponent, which leaves no room for carelessness or holding back. Izuku, look up. He turned toward his mentor, whose head was beamed up toward the sky, so he looked up too, his mouth growing agape with what met his eyes. Tens, if not hundreds of rocks had floated high above the arena. It had to be more than 5 times her own body weight. He hadn't even noticed it. He wouldn't have noticed it if Gami hadn't pointed it out, and suddenly the missing chunks of the arena made sense. Suddenly Uraraka's low stance made sense. Suddenly her unyielding charges made sense, and if he didn't realize it until now, from this eagle-eyed point of view in the stance, then there was no way that Bakugo could have put the pieces together from his spot within the suffocating smoke. Midori watched her hands come together, and he nearly shouted in delight, nearly jumping from his seat. All the debris she'd collected in getting Bakugo to wreck the arena had rained down from the sky all at once, barreling toward them in an instant. Not skipping a beat, Uraraka rushed forward once more, using that opportunity to try and close the gap one final time. She leapt toward him, reaching out her hand right to his chest, but was blown away by the absolute massive explosion that he released toward the sky. Everything was engulfed in a sea of fire, the heat and the smoke almost unbearable even from the stands. Midori was blown into his seat, forced to shut his eyes to protect them from the piercing dust. When he came back to, all that rained down from the sky were shards of what once was, trickling down pitifully compared to their former glory. Uraraka lay collapsed against the ground, Bakugo standing over, his hands clearly stiffened from the massive exertion of power. No. His fist shook, but not in disappointment. He could never be disappointed in her. She was amazing. Then, against all odds, she picked herself back up, rising to her feet, wiping the sweat and dust from her face. His heart nearly exploded as she rushed back towards him, this time Bakugo racing to meet her in the middle. But as she took another step, her body gave out on her, leaving her helpless to the ultimate collapse. Her weight capacity. She'd gone over it, with all that debris that she'd floated up, and after the relentless beating that she'd taken both before and after, her body couldn't keep up. Uraraka trembled against the ground. He could see her clawing into the dirt desperately, trying to pick herself back up. She swatted off Midnight, who'd squatted next to her to examine her condition. Uraraka is unable to continue. Bakugo moves on to the second round. She was wheeled off by Recovery Girl's medical robots, and that's when he couldn't take it any longer, jumping from his seat and racing out of the stands and into the interior like before. Izuku, wait! But he didn't listen, so Gami took some more proactive measures. Midori nearly choked as his feet slipped out from under him. Being pulled back by his waist, he was yanked into his mentor's chest, halting his movements completely. Stop! I need to go see her. But the ghost held tight as he struggled. Calm yourself. What will you say to her like this? That she... His adrenaline died down as he went limp in Gami's arms. That she was absolutely amazing, and that I couldn't have been more impressed than I was. Gami's heart softened, and he set him down instantly. I apologize. I thought you were going to do something more reckless and unthinking. No, I think you were right. He looked down at his shaking hands, now starting to settle down as the rush faded away. What was happening to him? I wasn't thinking. His mentor, sensing the incoming distress, placed his hand on his back to goad him. Come, let us hurry before your match starts. They started walking now, but Midori's head was all over the place. He felt so out of control, as of today, like he was suddenly out of touch with everything that he once knew so firmly. He hadn't even thought about his second match against Todoroki. What was he going to do? Should he fight to win? Should he fight to help? Could he do both? Was it possible to do either? He balled up his hands, never having felt so lost in his life. I'm not sure. What are you even doing here, Deku? He jumped out of his skin, looking to the side where Bakugo stood, just having come from the arena. His face ran pale, his heart threatening to stop functioning right then and there. What the hell was his shitty luck today? Was the universe just out to get him or something? Gami snarled like a feral animal, swirling around protectively. Bakugo, I was just going to see Uraraka. He finally stuttered out, pointing down his path, attempting to slink away as his voice grew dimmer. Congrats on your win. He scurried off and tried to get away like the rat he was. There was already too much. He didn't need this on top of it. You suggested that, didn't you? He stopped in his tracks. That fucking self-sacrificing scheme of hers. He looked off to the side. Gami was practically begging him to just walk away, to just leave him before something happened that he couldn't help against. Something like his middle school days. Something like those awful memories that just never went away. You caused me a lot of trouble there. I didn't. He spun around, for once facing Bakugo head-on somewhere off the battlefield. He didn't know where it came from, certainly not his own courage. It was so foreign, so much greater than himself, and yet it felt so right. Is this what it felt like to protect someone even when his very instincts screamed at him to run and hide? All of it. Uraraka came up with everything just to beat you. So if it really was a lot of trouble for you, because he really could get used to this, or maybe because he just enjoyed the frustrated look being on Bakugo's face for once, then that was Uraraka messing with you. Okay, so he totally didn't race out of there after saying that, obviously not, but regardless it did help him to pick up the speed. Upon getting to Recovery Girl's office, though, and finding Uraraka absent, he was severely disappointed at himself for not making it in time. Gami had to practically drag him to the prep room by hand, considering how depressingly he had dragged his feet. So imagine his surprise when he opened the door and found exactly who he was looking for. Uraraka! He shouted in surprise. She beamed at him, like he was so used to, and everything almost felt normal in that 1 second. Guess I lost. He stumbled inside dumbly, losing his entire train of thought in an instant. Are you hurt? Nah, I'm getting healed bit by bit so my stamina doesn't drain completely. She waved him off, pointing to her bandaged cheek. All that's left are really scrapes and bruises. She suddenly stood up, scraping the chair against the floor in a horrid screech. But darn it! Bakugo's just too strong. I couldn't put a scratch on him. She seethed, shaking her fist with clenched teeth. Guess I gotta try harder next time. He held out his hand gently. Hey, wait. She held out her hand to her chest and thought, You're always looking ahead to the next challenge, Midori. I lost, but I don't want to lose again. He opened his mouth to try and get the words out, but was once again more crudely interrupted. The second round of the tournament will be starting shortly. Get your concessions while you can. No, not yet. He didn't get to say... Uraraka frowned. Sorry for wasting your prep time. Good luck. I'll be rooting for you. Midoriya's head was too full. Too many things, too many priorities. He couldn't keep track of it all. Things were slipping through the cracks that he didn't know were there, and as he scrambled to pick things up before they fell, he dropped twice as much. I was looking for you, actually. He hesitated by the door, resting his hand on the knob, but nothing more. Deep breaths, come on. He couldn't get tripped up now. It wasn't about him right now anymore. There were things greater than himself, things more important than his silly problems. He finally had people to support. He couldn't screw up now. I just wanted to tell you that you were freaking amazing out there. He turned to her shocked expression, resembling how just before it was the stern look of determination in the face of sheer adversity. I was really, really impressed. The fight replayed in his head on a loop. He couldn't stop thinking about it, the way she started without hesitation, even though she had been nervous before, the way she fought with everything she had despite the overwhelming odds, the way she was blown back constantly, over and over again, and the way she just kept getting back up, over and over again. You're exactly the kind of hero I want to be. He smiled, and then left, sliding the door closed behind him without even a warning. She really was amazing. He had a lot to do to catch up. He shuffled down the hallway after hallway, mindlessly, not really thinking about where he was going, because every time he did, this sickening feeling rose up from his stomach. Why, he was just fine before, even if it was for a moment. He'd been pulling through every event after event with no issues, so why now? Why at all? He could feel himself slipping away back into the comforts of autopilot, where it was so much easier to just not think. He tried to push it back, because that's where he's supposed to be, right? But he didn't even know what he wanted anymore, and everything felt like too much, yet not enough. Is something wrong? Gami floated in front of him, looking him in the eye. They weren't floating or moving anymore. They had to keep moving. There were things that needed to be done, things so much greater than himself. He had no time to feel bad. It was selfish. How could he stand here so pathetically, where people needed him? People practically calling out for him. What was he doing? He could hear his head screaming at his heart, and still all he wanted to do was cry. The ghost watched the boy threaten to crumble in front of him, so he scooped up the pieces before he could fall apart completely. I feel so overwhelmed. His voice wavered as he tried to hold in the wetness coming from up his throat. The people I care about are struggling, and this is my chance to help them, and I don't know what to do. I'm just running into situations blindly and hoping that I can fix things, but I don't know what I'm doing. And if I keep going like this, I'm going to screw up and make everything worse." He balled his hands up at his eyes and tried to stop the tears, trying to hide his pathetic self from the world. What a pitiful child he was, about to collapse into the mess he was right in the midst of more important things, of greater things. If anyone saw him like this. He hiccuped at the thought, grinding his teeth to stop the sound from escaping. God, he was pathetic. Absolutely fucking pathetic. How could he ever help anyone, much less the people that needed it? After all, that was what he wanted to do. Gami could only hold his successor close as the tears threatened to spill. What the hell was he supposed to do then? Just because winging it had been practically all he'd been doing from the start? Was he just setting himself up to fail, then by Midoriya's standards? He thought that he'd been doing okay, but maybe he should be doing better. He didn't want to tell Midoriya not to cry, because that wasn't healthy, but at the same time he was due out on the field in less than 10 minutes, so instead he dabbed away the building tears before they could stain his cheeks. "You keep holding yourself to such high standards. It is unhealthy." Gami found himself lost often, more often than he would ever want to admit. He didn't know how to be a mentor, a parent. There wasn't a guidebook for these kinds of things, and it wasn't like he could go to anyone for help. He really didn't have much of a choice outside of doing things blind. It was that or nothing at all. "I know that you care about the people close to you, even the people that I may not think deserve you. Despite everything the world has put you through, you are still so kind. I admire that." But was being blind really that bad when it came from his heart? He jabbed lightly at the teen's chest, touching the spot right over his heart. "But you continue to forget that you are just a child. No one is expecting you to solve the world's problems, not even as an adult." "But it's not that hard. It shouldn't be." He pushed away the bony finger in frustration. "I'm not trying to fix the world, I'm just trying to help my friends." "But your friends are your world, are they not?" He stopped, wrapping his arms around himself to try and hold his shaking self together. Gami held him closer, swaddling him in his cloak like he used to when he was younger. "I just want everyone to be okay." "I know, but you have to be okay first." He held Midoriya's face in his bony hands before ruffling his hair lovingly, and upon seeing his eyes clear up, Gami knew that this was what he was meant to do. Midoriya was his everything, his world. Gami didn't have anyone else. If he could do anything with his afterlife, he would dedicate it to the boy in front of him. He would never leave his side. He would be his guidance, his support, anything that he could possibly need. It was the least he could do for the one person that he truly cared about. He beckoned him forward with a gentle tug of his hand. "Come, let us walk and talk." The teen wiped one last time at his eyes, stumbling behind the ghost like a lost puppy. "So, I presume it is your next match that brought this up?" Midoriya nodded, still not having the energy to be audible. Gami thought for a moment. "Now, I do understand that you wish to help him, especially since he came to you the way he did, but you do realize that he may not be in that semi-reasonable state when you come to face him now." "This uncontrollable urge of violence arises, directing me to hurt you, to make you suffer. Even now I feel nothing but contempt for you." He dug his fingers into his palms, but his gloves prevented his nails from really digging in. "You have to understand my concern that he will not think rationally, and if you are reluctant to fight him, you are inviting him to hurt you." Midoriya turned the corner, only to come face to face with arguably the last person he needed to see right now. Endeavor." He stumbled back. The flame hero turned to him, his impressive stature looming over him in the most intimidating way possible. The heat that came off his flames was suffocating, the air nearly becoming too thick to breathe. "There you are." The scar across his chest had burned like its birth, swelling him with a scale of fear that he hadn't felt since childhood. His heart jumped from his chest, climbing up his throat and threatening to leak from his lips. You were looking for me," he squeaked, stepping back. "Breathe. Come on. In and out. Steady." He wasn't back there. He was here at UA, standing in a hallway with Endeavor, which wasn't good, but it wasn't his father. It wasn't his father. That man was long gone, and he was tired of letting the past fuck with his present. "I saw what you did out there. You have an amazing quirk." The number 2 hero stepped forward, completely invading his personal space with a finger to his face as well. "Creating such force by manipulating air pressure. Very similar to All Might, if I might add." Fuck, this man had already figured out how his blasts worked by seeing them once in action. The Todoroki family was way too observant and intelligent for their own good and his goddamn sanity. Of course, he wouldn't be a Todoroki without some unnatural obsession with All Might. Midoriya felt bad for the #1 hero. He couldn't put up with this shit on a daily basis if it meant the difference between life and death. I have to get going. He tried to push past. Whatever he wanted, it obviously wasn't going to be any good for him. He had more important things to focus on, greater things. As he turned his back to him, Gami kept a close eye, tired of unwanted people butting into his important conversations. My boy, Shouto, has a duty to surpass All Might. He stopped, his whole body stopped. His heart stopped, his lungs stopped. His brain stopped, and everything just shut down. He'd nearly made it out of the hallway, too. Your match against him will prove to be a good test reference for that progress. That ugly feeling he had tasted before during Uraraka's match, it came back in full force. He nearly found himself shaking at the anger that brimmed beneath his skin, and how dare he? How dare he treat his own son like such a tool? God, they were just kids. They were just fucking kids. What did they ever do to deserve the absence of love? What did they ever do to deserve the full cruelty of the unforgiving world? It wasn't fair, and the thought was equally frustrating as it was depressing. So, put up a good fight against him. He knew that Gami didn't want to help Todoroki right now, not when he knew nothing about what was wrong, not when he was barred from helping with his fights, not when he'd been leaving himself vulnerable to something they didn't understand yet, and he understood. Gami was scared. Gami was afraid because he cared about him. Gami didn't want to see him throw himself into this because he didn't want him to get hurt. It made sense, he understood. Shit, he was scared too, but this was exactly why he had to. Midori was afraid because he cared about Todoroki. Just as Gami didn't want him to suffer, he couldn't stand seeing Todoroki suffer either. I don't understand. I feel like I'm losing control of myself, and it scares me beyond belief. He couldn't stand seeing him that way. That's all I have to say. Sorry for my bluntness. Because he cared, because he was afraid, that's why he had to do this now, because it was different. If it was Midori who needed rescuing, he was certain that Gami would never fail to appear. He could feel the heat recede. Endeavor must have been starting to walk off then. It was too bad, really. He'd nearly made it out of the hallway, too. I'm not All Might. He could hear the hero stop. Well, of course you're not. And the same goes for Shouto. He looked over his shoulder, right into the eyes of the #2 hero, who had turned around to look as well, into the eyes of fear. He looked hard and firm, and made sure that even if he was scared, that it didn't show. It was funny, really. Standing here, telling off the #2 hero, it was almost as if history was repeating itself. He was sure that All Might would get a good laugh out of this. Maybe one day he would too. He may be your son, but he certainly isn't you. Endeavor narrowed his eyes, his flames surging slightly, but the scar on Midoriya's chest remained dormant. He might have been afraid, but he was afraid of failing Todoroki, not of the scumbag in front of him. And then he walked off, the #2 hero never uttering a word. He walked off with a determination in his heart, fire in his eyes. He rounded a corner, and once he was sure he couldn't feel the residual heat off Endeavor's hell flames, he turned to Gami with a fierce resolve. I'm going to save him. And when the ghost didn't argue back, he knew that he understood. I cannot convince you otherwise, can I? Midori bundled a hand into his gym uniform top. I know I can't help everyone, as much as it hurts to admit, but if I can help anyone, I'm going to help him. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Maybe, as I said it aloud, I hoped that it would make sense to me, but now I feel like I've lost myself completely. I promised him. Gami looked off to the side for a moment, before returning back to him with a playful rustle of his hair. You are too good for this world. Just as you feel you are lucky to have the people in your life, they are lucky to have you. Midori teasingly shoved his mentor's hand out of his hair, though not without a laugh. Just be sure to return to me in one piece. He poked him gently in the chest again. Just as you cannot stand to see him in pain, neither can I towards you. The teen looked up into that dark hood, and while he couldn't see his face, he could still feel the honesty that came from his expression. I promise. And now for our first match of the second round. Midori stood on the arena battlefield, staring into a set of cold eyes as he was starting to find familiar. He wouldn't let that happen, though, not on his life. You ready? He whispered, but he knew the other heard him, even over the roar of the crowd. Todoroki didn't respond, continuing to pierce into him with that look of pure hate. So that's how this was going to be, then. Midori slipped off both of his gloves, stuffing them into his pockets. If that's how this was going to go, well, he promised someone that he'd come back intact, and he intended to keep it. Midoriya versus Todoroki. He took in a deep breath. He still wasn't sure exactly what he was going to do, but he knew what he had to do. He was going to shake that hate right out of his eyes. "Start!" Todoroki didn't even give him a second, sending a wave of piercing ice right at him with no intention of holding back. But Midoriya knew the ice was coming. That's how Todoroki always started off his matches, so he was ready to see it coming for him, moving straight to stab right through him. He was ready. He summoned his scythe in one quick swing, filling it with DT near instantly as his body responded to the adrenaline. He was ready to help. He cut right through the air in front of him and watched everything around him explode, shards of ice tumbling past him as he dug his heels into the ground to prevent the blowback. The pressure sent blasts of chilled air into the stands, thick strands of fog forming from the temperature difference. Still, he could see Todoroki clearly, having created a barrier of ice to stop himself from flying out of the ring. "Whoa! Midoriya smashed right through!" He held his weapon tightly, ignoring the murmurs that trickled down from the stands. All he was focused on was Todoroki and his pure apathy as he sent another charge of ice barreling. And again, he took another heave with his blade, sending an even bigger shockwave through the arena. He smashed it again! He panted under his breath. His arms really weren't used to lugging around his scythe, especially for more than one fully charged swing. And as well as he knew Todoroki, he didn't know how much about his fighting style he'd had developed since all of his matches ended near instantly, so he had to learn now. And in order to do that, he needed to stall this fight out as long as possible, and burning himself out on strength now was just not going to help. However, he was going to release Todoroki out of that hate. He needed time to do it. He slammed a bare hand into the dirt, letting his weapon disappear as he instead focused a rush of DT into the ground. The earth broke apart, cracked into pieces, threatening to swallow the arena whole. Midoriya figured now that Todoroki would be a little more hesitant to attack and blatantly at his raw display of power, but he underestimated his overdependence on his ice as well as the hate that ran through him. With a twist of his foot, another wave of ice rushed to meet him, also sealing over the cracks that gave him the advantage in the first place. He had no time to try and blast it with his scythe, so he outstretched a hand instead, trying to push forth more of the buzzing from his veins. His fingertips met ice and began to freeze over as the ice had continued, but its progress was halted immediately, and then reversed as it decayed away. His hands stung from the cold and the numerous cuts that the sharp shards of ice had given him in retaliation, causing him to stagger back. But Todoroki gave him no breathing room, relentlessly casting another spike of ice. "Trying to stretch this match out?" Those were the first words that he'd said to him since they'd come out here. "I'll end you." Midoriya's heart chilled, but unless he wanted to be frozen over completely, he couldn't hesitate. He reached out to touch the ice again, finding its newfound strength as Todoroki poured more into it. Frost covered his hand and creeped up his arm, nearly reaching his elbow, and that's when his heart stopped. Todoroki wasn't trying to immobilize him. He was trying to encase his whole body in an ice prison. And by the look in his eye, he wasn't going to have his head spared like Sero. His survival instincts exploded. Was he really trying to kill him? The Todoroki he knew would never do this, not even just to him, but to any student in a tournament spar. DT flooded his encased hand in response, and suddenly the ice exploded from the inside, decay spreading outwards like the plague. Midoriya gripped his hand as he went stumbling back. His entire arm trembled from the frost, some still stuck within him and his skin like an infection. His hand especially shook violently, covered in streaks of red that traveled up past his wrist. He didn't decay that normally. He'd accidentally exploded it instead, out of nothing but desperation. He watched his fingers seize and thrash, pain shooting through his nerves and up to his brain. He had to bite down onto his cheek to keep the scream from coming out. Todoroki rushed forward in the wake of the destruction, once more releasing a barrage of ice as he stepped. But Midoriya couldn't use his scythe to blast it away, not with just one hand, and he needed to save his other one as well, because having two near-useless hands would certainly spell his doom. So he grit his teeth and held out his shaking hand, straining the crystalline ice red as he managed to cut into skin before he could fully disintegrate it. But as the ice shattered, he wasn't prepared for Todoroki to come flying over it, riding a piece of the broken ice to gain its momentum. "Shouto, please!" he cried out now that they were close enough that no one else would hear. "I know this isn't you." But when he met the dark, dead look in his eyes, he realized he had no intention of stopping. He tumbled back as Todoroki slammed his hand down into the spot that he was once standing, large and deadly spikes of ice growing instantly. His blood ran cold, not just from the frost chunks in his arm. If he would have been even a second slower, well, he wouldn't have been dead, but only because it wasn't physically possible to kill him. He glanced back over to try and gauge his next move when Todoroki snapped a look at him. The expression on his face of unyielding anger, of hatred, of uncontrollable violence. There was no room for argument. Something was seriously wrong. Todoroki launched an aggressive wave of ice, and because he was much closer than before, Midoriya didn't have enough time to react. He tried to jump away, but the ice followed him up into the air, snagging his foot and slowly creeping up his leg. Stray spikes and shards cut into him as he tried to yank his foot free, but it was no use. Seeing that his prey had finally been caught, Todoroki leapt toward him, his right hand frosted over and aiming right for his neck. His undamaged hand shot out to protect him instinctively, DT rushing to his aid, and he realized his mistake instantly. He wasn't going to touch Todoroki. He wasn't going to kill him. He needed to get away. He was just too close. His mind was flooded with fear and desperation, and his veins with adrenaline and power, and with no other options, he repeated the one plea that had saved him thus far. "Please." A massive blast exploded from his hand, sending bursts of wind pressure in every direction. Hats flew away, hair was whirlwinded into a frenzy, and people were even knocked off their feet. Midoriya was ripped from the ice instantly, Sense getting back but still standing. Todoroki, however, had tumbled to a stop, having to use his ice to break his momentum. A wave of excruciating pain rushed through his hand. He looked down at them now. They were both shaking uncontrollably, covered in small cuts that added together, painting his arms red. Frost stuck to his skin and pulled painfully every time that he tried to move his elbow, and now a new heavier layer of frost had settled from his foot all the way up to his knee, preventing him from comfortably putting weight onto it. He was beat up, a glorified punching bag at this point. Tears welled in his eyes. He could brute force his way through anything if he really put his mind to it, but this? His hands were practically begging to be ripped from his body, nerve by nerve, and hell, he'd probably feel relief if he decided to just cut them both off right now. And yet, despite the obvious agony he was in, Todoroki seemed to be enjoying it. "Trying to get me to stay back?" he asked emotionlessly, uncaring to the fact that he was practically dead on his feet. "Are you afraid?" Fuck, he was terrified. Midori nearly slumped over, stumbling to keep his balance without full control of most of his limbs. He allowed his arms to hang limply at his sides, beads of blood running down his spazzing fingers and onto the dirt. He panted heavily, trying to catch his breath as the adrenaline began slowing down. "Only defending and dodging. Pathetic, really." Todoroki mocked him from afar. He struggled to lift himself to meet his gaze, but when he did, he noticed something he hadn't before. Todoroki was shivering. Now that he was looking at it, he could see the ice building up on his right side. He could see the way his steps were slower, muddier than before. Todoroki's left side could easily fix that, helping him to regulate his body temp. But even in this unnatural state, he still held on to that hate for his father. "I guess I should thank you for going down so pitifully to my ice." Todoroki shrugged apathetically, eyes shifting to the side. "Because of that." He turned his own head to follow his gaze, locking onto the disapproving stare of Endeavor, who stood harshly at the stand's edge. "He doesn't look too happy." That was it. He didn't know how to help Todoroki before because he was focusing on the hate that he was feeling toward him. Neither of them understood it, simply acknowledging its existence as unnatural and oppressive, and that unknown scared him so much that he let it consume the entirety of his focus. He couldn't do anything about the hate that now he had because he had nothing to appeal to. Todoroki's rationality was gone. He didn't care if he was beat up or broken or too injured to move. That was all he wanted, in fact, to see him suffer. He couldn't free his friend from this uncontrollable violence by using himself as a sob story. Instead, without something else to appeal to, there was no way that he could get through to him. Except there was something else. "I despise my father's fire. I hate everything he stands for." He couldn't heal this unnatural hate towards him, because he didn't understand the reason behind it. There was none. But he understood why Todoroki hated his left side. "With both your hands in that state, as they are, you can't fight anymore," Todoroki scoffed. "Let me end you." And because he understood, he could reason. The sweat that ran down Midoriya's face chilled instantly at the blockade of ice that was shot toward him. He grit his teeth, tasting the iron bleeding from the inside of his mouth, and if he could reason, there was a chance that he could get through to him. There was a chance he could break the hate by breaking his philosophies completely, just like Kiori had done for him. "Who says I'm done?" Midoriya raised an injured hand, and without even a second thought he let out a massive explosion that shattered the impending waves of spikes, but this time he didn't feel fear. He didn't feel desperation, just the pure and unwavering determination to save his friend. He couldn't even grip his hands anymore, both in too much pain to console the other. He couldn't even keep them still, losing any control he had left over the nerves in his forearms. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him to brunt the full extent of what he'd put himself through. Todoroki again prevented himself from flying out of bounds with a wall of ice. "Why are you going this far?" Sure, he was running on fumes, dying embers that could barely cultivate anymore, but he refused to give up. He refused to give in to the pain and the agony of existing right now. "You're shivering, Shouto." Because this was greater than himself. "Quirks are still just physical abilities." His voice was wet with sweat and blood. "You must have a limit to how much of that cold you can bear." His existence would always be greater than himself. He lifted a hand to point at him, though it couldn't be called much of a point when he couldn't curl his fingers. "But you could always use your left side to thaw yourself out, right?" He knew he couldn't. He couldn't help everyone. He knew that he couldn't save everyone, but someone like him, some existence like his, it demanded him to use it to help as many people as he could, because he was gifted with abilities that could protect him. He would use them to protect others. "What right do you have to call me pathetic, when you've only been using half of your power and it's not enough?" Todoroki heaved out a puff of fog, grinding his teeth as his eyes darkened. But this time it wasn't mindless hate. It was fueled anger, anger he could recognize. "Half my power? Did my bastard of a father pay you off or something?" A dangerous amount of ice had collected in his right hand before he suddenly dashed at him. "You're pissing me off." Midori couldn't deal with him at close range. There was no way that he could use his scythe offensively with his hands in the condition they were in, and he couldn't use DT against Todoroki by hand regardless of their condition. Explosions by hand were too risky to be actively using against a person without knowing how to regulate them. What could be done? What could he do? He looked at his shaking hands, and with a lot more effort and a lot of biting down, he could curl into one fist. Time to do this the old-fashioned way, then. He dashed forward, too, running right at Todoroki. He held himself low to the ground, just like he saw Uraraka do against Bakugo. His positioning forced Todoroki to maneuver his right hand out of the way, since he couldn't get a clear shot at a kill point, and the second he did, Midori forced his hand into a sudden fist and socked him right in the stomach. He couldn't stop the scream that exploded from his lips, along with the spats of blood that were trying to be contained in its absolute agony as it shot up his arm and straight into his brain. His nerves were fried beyond repair, to the point where the pain was starting to mellow out. He couldn't feel much of anything anymore, not even the chunk of his arm that Todoroki managed to touch and freeze over. Todoroki skidded to a stop just a little ways away, picking himself up with a laugh, sickening, an emotionless laugh. "So now you're on the offensive?" He fired off another wave of ice, but despite his pain and lag, Midori was easily able to dodge it, not having to move much at all. "It's not just you that's slowing down," he reprimanded. "Your ice is getting weaker." "Shut up!" He stomped down with his right foot, a burst of ice exploding out that was too wide to dodge. He raised out an arm, crying out as his skin ripped from the ice that partially encased it. Didn't even have to think to release an explosion of his own. He didn't even feel the pain anymore. Numbness traveling up through his body as naturally as blood and adrenaline. The blast was much weaker than before. It wasn't just Todoroki getting worn out. Todoroki was sent tumbling away again. "Why are you going this far?" But Midori didn't waste any time dashing toward him again. "I figured out who I want to be." He thought about Uraraka. "We're getting it back, Midori, no doubt." He thought about Ida. "So I, too, challenge you." He thought about Asui. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I left you." He thought about Aizawa. "Don't do anything rash." "I want to be a hero who never gives up, regardless of how impossible the obstacles in front of me seems. I want people to see me and know that I'll be there until everything's okay again." He missed how Todoroki winced at his declaration. "That's why I refuse to give up." He didn't think that he could even get either hand into a fist anymore. He didn't think that he could move either of them, so he bounced off the balls of his feet, headbutting Todoroki instead. Midori stumbled, but managed to stay upright. He didn't think that he could get back up if he fell over. He didn't think his hands still had the strength to lift him. "Your experiences, despite how similar we are, I'll never be able to understand them fully." He steadied himself as Todoroki recovered, watching him struggle to stand. "But by dictating the rest of your life to one half of yourself, you're not denying him anything. You're giving him complete control over you." "Shut up." His right side was nearly covered in frost. Even from a distance, Midori could see him shaking almost as much as he himself was. He'd have to give it to him. Todoroki was clearly crazily resilient, dare say to the same level that he himself was. But just as he saw resilience, he could see stubbornness, as Todoroki refused to let go of that hate. I'll show my father. I don't need his quirk. It's your power, isn't it? Midoriya screamed, blood seeping from his teeth and his words. You decide who you want to become. And in that 1 second, he stared hard into Todoroki's eyes. And that 1 second was all it took to break the hate, to smash it into a million pieces. That 1 second was all it took to light up the arena in a blaze of fire. And as the inferno swirled before him, as the flames licked his weeping skin and his broken body, as the heat forced its way into his face and down his throat, as the smoke suffocated the very air around him, he found himself oddly at peace. As the world burned around him, he could no longer feel the fear of the fire in his heart. All he could do, as he watched the flames pour off of Todoroki's left side, was smile. I want to be a hero. A loud disruption came from the stands, a deep and familiar voice blasting its way down to the very edge, but neither of them paid any attention to it, too lost within themselves and their own little world. Midoriya watched Todoroki wipe his face with his wrist, and his heart felt just a little lighter. With those wounds, in this situation, those were the first words that he'd said to him since they'd come down here. You must be crazy. Midoriya almost worried that he hadn't managed to clear the hate from Todoroki's head, but looking into his eyes, he saw his very soul, and all he saw was liberation. Still, I hope you can honor my request for one last standoff. He laughed hoarsely to himself, wet with blood and relief. Who was he to deny him that after everything? Todoroki lit himself ablaze, firing off one last massive wave of ice as he rocketed forward with his newfound firepower, and Midoriya nearly got caught up in it all, in the awe. How incredible, how absolutely incredible. But a promise was a promise, and despite his body practically falling apart on him, barely being held together through the sheer will alone, he found the rejuvenation to summon his scythe, lifting it far behind his head. He pumped it with every last ounce of deity he had left, waiting until the ice was just at his feet, before swinging it forward relentlessly, slicing through the very fabric of the universe. He didn't even notice Cementos or Midnight trying to rush in and stop their clash. If they did anything, he didn't notice it at all against the absolute nuke that shook the entire arena, right off its foundation. Dust and smoke billowed in plumes as the combination of air pressures from them both destroyed each other and everything else in the process, flinging people around like a hurricane. As clarity returned, the arena resembled a war field, massive cracks and craters decorating it like battle scars. People desperately looked amongst the wreckage, trying to decipher if anyone was still even alive after that. Todoroki stood by the edge of the arena, ice holding him in place, holding his body upright. Half of his uniform was eaten away by the flames, smoke seeping off of his bare skin, and yet there wasn't a single shred of ice left frozen on his body. He looked like he hadn't even used his right side at all. As the smoke at the edge of the arena cleared, Midoriya was revealed to the crowd, practically embedded in the arena wall. His body was pasted amidst the fragments of cement, broken, bloody uniform torn up completely, and his skin was black and blue from the frostbite and the blood loss, and his chest heaved in a shatter, desperately trying to take in air. He had nothing left, the embers inside of him smothered. Midoriya is out of bounds. He couldn't make out words any more, his ears ringing deafeningly, his vision swept in and out like the tide, and yet his heart still beat it fiercely, commanding him to see, to hear, to fight. He was going to be a hero that would never give up, a hero that would remain standing until everything was okay again. And so, with effort and consciousness that shook the audience, everyone watching to their core, he lifted his head, trying to use his fractured hands to push himself off the wall. With a disturbing scrape, gravity peeled him from the wall like an unwanted wad of gum, dropping him dejectedly to the ground on his own 2 feet. The shock of the landing was too much for his abused nerves, however, and he seized up, wobbled and fell to the ground in a heap. Todoroki moves on to the 3rd round. And even against the dirt, Midoriya smiled. Everything was okay again. His vision blurred, rust leaking from every orifice of his body. He really had nothing left. His body begged to let him rest, to give in, and now that everything was okay again, he found himself submissive and willing. If he could have done anything else, he would have tried harder to have kept his promise to Gami, but he couldn't have done it all. His body drifted off to sleep, dragging him into the darkness. He hoped that the ghost would forgive him. Midoriya woke up to pain, A rude awakening, really, not one all too particularly enjoyable, but it was nothing like what he'd felt on the field. Before, pain was all he could think about, and now it simmered in the back of his mind like a low buzz. He forced open his eyes with a groan, nearly closing them up again at the bright lights above him. Ugh, it made his head hurt. Could somebody turn those down? He was in a hospital cot, much like how he'd woken up after the USJ. He laid reclined, but his body was much too sensitive to be so upright. His uniform top had been stripped from him. His chest, instead, was swaddled in layers of bandages. Both his arms were wrapped up completely, with his fingers just barely peeking out. He didn't see skin, though, just black fabric. He wasn't wearing his gloves, the last he remembered. Had someone put them on for him? How had they even survived? Still, despite his hands being covered and enveloped, his fingers still trembled uncontrollably, though not as violent as before. He really couldn't feel them move at all. He stirred a little more actively this time, trying to put his foggy pieces of his mind back together again, and that's when he was alerted to the presence of another. Izuku! Todoroki leapt to his bedside, just barely restraining himself at the edge of the cot. Where had he come from? What was going on? Hey, it is all right. A familiar soothing touch had drifted through his hair. He didn't know where he was, but he was safe. He was safe. We are so glad that you are all right. Kami sounded wet and shaken, but Midoriya didn't really register it against the comforting strokes in his hair. He has been here nearly as long as I have. He squinted his eyes, trying to clear up the fogginess. Shouto? At the response, he watched Todoroki collapse in sudden relief, gripping tightly onto the metal railing of the cot as he lowered his head, his hair falling over his eyes. He shook lightly, sort of like his fingers did, sparking Midoriya to try and reach out to help him, but he couldn't get his body to move. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Todoroki beat up into himself, gritting his teeth in shame and anger. Hey! No, don't tell me it's okay. He interrupted in frustration, looking up at him finally. His eyes were glossy, but he dared not to cry. Still, his face said it all, the vulnerability, the fear, the humiliation. It was the most expressive he'd ever seen the boy. I hurt you. I almost killed you. I tried to. So don't tell me it's okay. It's not okay. Todoroki hunched over the cot, desperately trying to hold himself together before he fell apart. He was being eaten alive by guilt, much like how Midoriya found himself more often than he'd like to admit. His heart was bleeding, watching his friend trying to hold on to this facade as his emotions tore him into pieces. Still, he couldn't help but pick up onto something else entirely. Does that mean you don't hate me anymore? Todoroki stopped completely, standing up straight. He clutched at his chest, now covered in a brand-new uniform top, and his eyes widened in shock as he found nothing. I can't feel it anymore, he stuttered, realizing that the fog in his mind had completely vanished. It's gone. It's left my head. I'm free. I am myself. And Midoriya smiled as much as his strained muscles let him. Everything was okay again. He could rest easy. He'd managed to help someone he cared about, just as others had for him. He'd promised, and he'd fulfilled. He attempted to sit further up in his cot, but his arms were much too numb and frail to support his weight. He hadn't regained enough motor skills to properly maneuver himself, and instead he nearly stumbled back into the pillow behind him. Kami, however, was quick to catch him, gently hoisting him up by his armpits to hide his phantom force as Midoriya's own. Please, do take it easy, he commanded, but still helped him up, remaining close by his side even after. Todoroki looked back at him, his attention grabbed by the movement, and now getting a glimpse at the entirety of Midoriya's injuries. The heavy casts around his arms, the wrappings that covered his chest, the brace that contained one of his frostbitten legs, the discoloration of his visible skin, his trembling fingers. He balled a hand into a shame-ridden fist. God, I'm pathetic. His voice wavered as he raised another hand to cover his face, scrunching his fingers into his hair. You've done so much for me, and look at how I've returned the favor. I can't even bear to look at what I've done. But Midoriya wasn't swayed. He still smiled, raising a hand to try and reach him, but he fell short, his arm collapsing right by the metal railing. I promised you that I wasn't going to give up on you. This is nothing to help someone important to me. He then looked down at himself and at his injuries. Sure, they were severe, and sure, they hurt him terribly, but he would heal, he would live, and in a life where that would always be constant, pain would never be an issue, not at the expense of saving a life or helping one to be okay again. He would never give up on anyone, not even as his body gave up on him. His eyes settled on the massive and ugly burn scar that danced along his chest. It had long since faded in vibrancy over the years, but especially now he noticed it really blended into his skin, settling as nothing more broken than pigmentation. It was just there, and for really the first time, he wasn't able to see it as he was even looking at it. He finally felt the same as when he was able to ignore its presence by ignoring its existence, except now he stared at it in full form. He left me years ago. 11. I doubt he even gives me a thought, but I think about him every day. Every time I get too close to a flame, to a friend, to a mirror. I hated looking at it because all I could see was a reminder of how much he hated me. Now I see it. He was able to bring up a hand to his chest, albeit shakily, and trace his trembling fingers over the scar, not being able to really tell the difference, though not because of the numbness. And instead of being reminded that he hurt me, I'm reminded that he can't hurt me anymore. Because while the trauma of his early past had faded in the midst of the whirlwind that was his school years so far, now it was truly settled. He finally let that loose end tie together and return it to the depths of his heart. He would never forget that it was there, that it was impossible, but he would be free of the hold it had over him. His father no longer held any control over him, and the leash that bound him to his uncaring hand was finally cut, dissolving into nothing more than a reminder of his upbringing. His blood was not a thing to be bound by. He glanced up, now realizing that Todoroki was staring at him intently. His eyes were filled with confusion and disbelief, his mouth contorting into a grimace as he was met with the opposing soft and forgiving eyes of Midoriya. I don't understand. Why do you keep helping me after everything? He questioned quietly, unable to understand. You should hate me. Why don't you hate me? Midori couldn't help the giggle that escaped his lips, dry from the dust in his lungs, but full from the genuineness in his heart. I could never hate you, silly. He shakily pointed toward Todoroki's chest, toward his left side. You mean too much to me for that. You're someone I care about. And everything was so much brighter in that one moment. Todoroki finally dropped his shoulders, finally losing the tension so pent up inside him, finally letting the smile that he'd locked away resurface to his cheeks. It was small. Nothing extravagant, but it was real. Midori wasn't sure he'd ever seen Todoroki smile, but he'd remember the moment forever, keeping it close to his heart as the aftermath of his first true triumph. Thank you, Izuku. I promise I'll never let you down again. Midori shook his head. You never let me down to begin with. They simply basked in each other's company, finally understanding that everything was indeed okay again. They were okay, and now they'd never allow the other to be alone again. The sincerity of the moment was rich, leaving room for nothing but themselves. Ah, dearie, you're awake. And the two remained two no longer. Recovery Girl strolled to his bedside, having appeared from behind the separation curtain. Her cane clicked against the tile with each step, finally pulling herself into her swivel chair. Are you feeling all right? I apologize for interrupting, but I didn't want to leave you unattended any longer. Gami floated next to him. She did intend to heal you fully, but that would have seemed extremely suspicious considering the nature of your injuries. She has been concerned for your condition. Midori grinned sheepishly, still managing to sit up in his cot. I mean, I'm in pain, but it's nothing I haven't felt before. Honestly, I feel good as new. But the nurse was not convinced, threatening him with an aggressive wave of her cane. That isn't something you should be proud of. In fact, you told me you weren't going to end up here next round. He held out his hands defensively, still unable to take full control of his fingers as they wobbled and shook. I know, I'm sorry, it's just things happened and... I get it. She held out her hand to stop him. But I'm concerned about your tendency to destroy yourself as a means to an end. She remembered that Todoroki was still in the room, right on the other side of Midoriya's cot, and paused, but her duty as a healer came before her preferences of her patients, and her thoughts needed to be said. The injuries you received weren't as severe as they seemed in the moment. The heroine nodded at his bandaging. But the injuries you inflicted upon yourself are what really has me worried as a nurse. Recovery Girl held out a hand, taking one of his own. His fingers quivered against her palms uncontrollably, despite his attempts to steady them. Those blasts you've been using, they're causing you extreme nerve damage. She placed his hand back on the cot gently, patting his cast lightly. I'll be able to heal the rest later, but there's a possibility your hands will never truly regain their full mobility. He caught the nod to Gami's earlier comment. She'd refrained from healing him fully out of the suspicion it might cause, but still he looked down at his hands, at the quaking of his fingers, and the true horror set in. His immortality was not a healing factor. He very well couldn't die, but that didn't mean that he couldn't end his hero career early if he continued down this reckless path. I know that this new technique is something you've discovered. It's powerful, but please, don't come back to me with those kinds of injuries again. You're a smart boy. You can figure out another way. He looked up to her. With shaky eyes, he nodded. He would have to figure out something else. Now, if you feel up to it, you're free to return back to the stands. She hopped off of her swivel chair, walking toward her desk. I'll find you later to finish up your healing. He nodded enthusiastically, then suddenly realized that his non-existent perception of time was there as well. Wait, how long have I been here? The arena was nearly destroyed completely. Todoroki filled in, reminding everyone of his presence. They were still fixing it the last time I checked. I doubt you really missed any matches. Midori shuffled himself closer to the edge of the cot. Still, we better hurry before one starts without us. His legs dangled off, but despite the drop being barely more than a few inches, he found himself nervous at how it would feel. Now that he was fully awake, his current pain simmered down to nothing but background buzz, but after Recovery Girl's declaration, he was suddenly hyper-aware of every injury on his body. He knew everyone was watching him, but he still trembled from within his own thoughts, starting to match his fingers. Give me a second. But before he could hesitate any further into his head, Todoroki held out his hand, open and welcoming. Let me help you. Midoriya stared at it, feeling his own shaking against the cot before reaching out to take it. Having others rely on him meant knowing when to rely on others, too. He took Todoroki's hand within his own and let the other help him off the cot and to his feet. He wobbled on his feet, but Todoroki was there to make sure that he didn't fall, holding him firm and steady. Let me go get you a spare uniform, too, Recovery Girl announced, reminding him that he was in fact not wearing one. I'm sure the sleeves should fit over your arm, Cass. She then disappeared behind the parting curtain, leaving the two as two once more. Midoriya finally settled into some sort of balance, letting go of Todoroki's hand. Thanks, Shouto. I really appreciate it. The other nodded, bringing his hand back to his side. Can I ask you something, Izuku? Caught off guard, he stuttered dumbly. Sure, what's up? Todoroki looked at him with a cock of his head. Who's Gami? Midoriya's breath hitched in his throat like he was choking, coughing violently in the most indiscreet way imaginable. It took every ounce of self-restraint in his body to not look directly at the ghost in question, with one thought echoing over and over in his mind. What the hell happened while I was asleep? Gami, he hashed out like a short-circuiting machine, waving his hands uncharacteristically. I don't know who you're talking about. He could hear his mentor slap himself in disappointment from behind him, and who could blame him? That was the most unconvincing thing he'd ever heard. You were muttering the name in your sleep, but if you say so. Todoroki was very obviously unconvinced, but dropped the subject. Of course, really, just his luck. Not much I could do to stop you, Gami shrugged, and Midoriya nearly reached out to hit him right then and there. Here you go, dearie. Recovery Girl came back with impeccable timing, holding a spare gym uniform top in her hand. Do you need help putting it on? No, I think I got it. He reached out for the top, and she handed it to him. His hands spazzed, causing it to fall to the floor instead. His heart sank along with it. He had to find another way. Before he could try and bend his body to retrieve it, Todoroki had already picked it up off the floor, holding it open with both hands. Let me help you. And so he did, letting his friend hold open the jacket while he slipped his swaddled arms through the sleeves, making sure that they rested comfortably on his cast before zipping up the front. His fingers fumbled with the zipper an embarrassing amount of times, much too uncoordinated to complete the action smoothly. He needed to find another way. You get going now, Recovery Girl shooed them off, or you'll miss the rest of the matches. Right. They both made their way to the door, and Todoroki slid it open for him. Thank you. They slipped out of her office and began a slow, stumbly walk back to the Class A stands. Todoroki walked strictly at his side, ready to catch him if he tripped, but Midori had already regained a surprising amount of mobility back, other than his hands, of course. After a quietly peaceful stroll back to the stands, Todoroki stopped. Will you be all right if I leave you here? Yeah, I'll be good, he stammered, though not without some confusion. You won't be watching the other matches? Todoroki shook his head, looking down at his left hand. There is much I have to think about. Midori couldn't hide his disappointment, but he tried his best. Oh, okay. Good luck out there. I'll be rooting for you. He pulled away, ready to start his waddle out to the stands, but Todoroki seemed hesitant to let go. Are we good? There was an unreal amount of doubt and uncertainty in his voice, itself seeming like a young child. Of course, I told you before. He smiled softly at the other. I'd do it again, too. Todoroki seemed to think about that before extending out his left hand once more. Friends, Izuku. Midoriya's smile grew both in size and in brightness. Oh, how far they'd come. He lifted one of his injured hands. He really couldn't bring his fingers to curl around Todoroki's like a handshake, so he settled for resting it lightly against the other's. There was a slight aura of warmth to meet him, soothing, the incessant buzz that rattled under his skin. How far they'd go together. Friends, Shouto. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 34 of Deku and Death. Chapter 35 will be next. I hope you guys are still enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.